This is a review of The Lord of the Rings, Weapons and Warfare by Chris Smith, published to coincide with the release of Return of the King in 2003 in hardcover and paperback. This is obviously the paperback version we're looking through here. So the last Lord of the Rings book we looked at was a rather scathing review of the visual companions, but what I should have mentioned in those reviews is that there is actually an antidote to the misery that is those books, and that is this book, Weapons and Warfare. Essentially everything I criticized about the visual companions, everything I said they should have done, you can see on display in this book. So I guess, in a sense, this is a lore book, but, as you may have guessed from the title, one that specifically focuses on weapons and warfare, so the weapons, the armor, the battles, things like that, rather than trying to cover everything about sort of the lore and history of Middle-earth, although tons of that stuff is brought into play into this book, but more as background as it relates to the warfare. Now, one thing I think it's very important to stress is that this is in no way a behind-the-scenes sort of book. You will see as we go through it things like concept art and maquettes, but those are just for illustrative purposes. At no point do you hear from the filmmakers or artists. There's nothing in here that is about the making of the movies themselves. And so what it's doing so well that the visual companions completely neglected to do, it's using the stories and battles in the movies as a base, but then expanding on the lore presented in the movies. So if you are someone who has only seen the movies, never read the books, you're going to learn a lot about Middle-earth, its cultures, the characters, beyond what is presented in the movies. And so I think it's really cool to sort of see this book as a potential stepping stone, I think, for a lot of people who enjoyed the movies, haven't read the books, and realize that there's so much more to Middle-earth and its characters that aren't explored in the movies, and that this book can sort of like be a transition or a gateway into that wider world. Now, having said that, it is very important that we address some of the shortcomings with the book, just so that you understand exactly what this book is. So the most important thing you have to know about this book is that this is a book on Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, not necessarily Tolkien's books. Because, as I'm sure most people know, the movies are not a 100% accurate adaptation of the books. And so then the major issue with this book is that for the expansion it's doing on the story in the movies, for the background it's drawing from, is very much from Tolkien. But then it's also blending that with some of the things that are, I guess, either made up by Peter Jackson and the writers, or Weta, or maybe even the author Chris Smith himself. Most of the text is a lot of description of the arms and armor of various characters and races in Middle-earth, how they're made, what the rationale behind their design is. But I just wish I understood more whether all this stuff is coming from Chris Smith, the author, his mind, or if this stuff is heavily based on actual, historical accounts of arms and armor, or if it's based on design rationale created by the filmmakers or the people at Weta. It really is just an issue that's plaguing the book. Of the conceit of this book is that it's an expansion of the Middle-earth that we see in the movie, but I still feel a little confused about exactly whose version of Middle-earth this is. Ideally I would like to think this information is coming from interviews that the author perhaps did with people at Weta and the filmmakers, but because this is never really explained, I end up just thinking that it's speculation on the author's behalf, and a lot of this is just made up by him. And, the actual answer is almost certainly a combination of all of these things, but there really should have been, even an introduction or something more thoroughly explaining this. And so, like I said, I really do think this is a good stepping stone from movie to book, but you have to understand that it very much takes sides with the movie much more so than the book, but unfortunately not necessarily doing it in a way that avoids a lot of the sort of muddying of the waters, a lot of confusion when it comes to the information and sort of lore presented in this book. And this is really exemplified by the fact that all of the information is being presented as sort of in-world, like it's real, like these weapons and things are actual historical artifacts, as if the history of Middle-earth is real. And so sometimes it will draw freely and indiscriminately from Tolkien's work without giving any sort of indication of that. And so in order to keep up this idea that the book is written by someone in Middle-earth, Tolkien is never mentioned in name, instead is just referred to as some other scholar. But then sometimes it'll cite sort of appropriate sources for this sort of thing, like according to the Red Book of Westmarch, but then other times the book just makes up sources, like it'll say, some scroll called The Fighting Styles of Middle-earth that was borrowed courtesy of the Rivendell Library, and it's like, what? In a lot of these lore books that are written from a sort of in-world perspective, this sort of mention of extracts from additional fictitious books in the world actually helps make a really a stronger, more immersive, that sort of helps cement the reality that this could be a real book from the world. But in this book, it is just it really is one of the most poorly executed examples I've ever come across. And the unfortunate result is this leads to a lot of confusion and ambiguity, which you don't want from a book like this that you're supposed to be coming to for information. So people who have never read the book might be a little bit misled, and even people who have read the book and seen the movies a bazillion times like myself, there was still so much confusion as to where is this information coming from? And so it just sort of feels like I'm reading a Frankenstein version of Lord of the Rings. However, it's not like this is the sort of thing that is happening, every page. And in fact, there are times when the book presents a sort of made-up, unique expansion of the movie's lore that actually works really well. For example, Tolkien is very ambiguous as to what happens to the rings, the 9 rings of the Kings of Men. But in the movies, the filmmakers chose to have the ring wreaths keep their rings, which that's a detail you honestly cannot even see or make out in the movies, because you never get a close-up of it or an explanation of it. But it is actually something that the filmmakers conceived of and designed in their telling of this story. And so in this book you will see a really cool photo of one of the Kings of Men's ring, but it's actually a corrupted version. So the ring has corrupted and changed and become more evil as the king himself has, turned into a ring wraith. And for me, those are the things that I actually think are really cool, because that's not from Tolkien. It is very much from the movies, but it's something that we don't actually get to see or experience in the movie itself. So this expansion is in line with the movie, but presenting information that is completely unique and actually makes this book worthy of your time and interest. Another thing this book does so much better than the visual companions is, interestingly, the visuals. Now, it almost certainly does rely too heavily on stills from the movies, but I found I was really able to overlook this thanks to the amount and variety of other visuals presented in the book. So you get things like maps or battle plans, a lot of concept art from the movies, as well as some of the sculptures and maquettes. Although, to be honest, I don't think I saw any concept art or anything that I haven't seen in the actual art of the Lord of the Rings books themselves. Definitely my favorite images that I haven't seen anywhere else except this book are the isolated photos of the individual armor components. I think even beyond fans of the movies, if you're someone who likes the Lord of the Rings tabletop RPGs or war games, the specific focus of this book is probably going to be something you'll really enjoy as well. Also, I really like the number of images and the way that they don't take up any more space than necessary. Sometimes they can be a little bit too small and you lose a little bit of detail in the armor or the maps, but overall I do prefer this approach of having a greater quantity of smaller images rather than having just a few giant page-wasting images, which is typically how these books tend to go. Another thing is, even though it's quite a large book and, got tons of text in it, it's also important to note that a lot of this text is just recapping things that you've seen in the movies, like, giving a play-by-play of the battles that you've already seen enacted on screen. However, I think the expanded details and background that the book does give does in fact outweigh that sensation that you are reading something you've already seen or know before. Also, the text is quite brisk. It moves over things quite quickly. You do get a lot more depth of the lore than is presented in the movies, of course, but still not quite touching the same level of depth as you would get from, say, Tolkien's Appendices or the Silmarillion, things like that. But yeah, on the whole, I really like this book. It obviously has a little bit of a conflicted nature, causing some confusion, and it would have been nice to see a little less reiteration of things that are already in the movie, but honestly, I'm just glad to see that they released a Lord of the Rings book where it's apparent that someone actually put effort into making something worthwhile for the fans, as opposed to the approach they've used with most of the books that have come out for this trilogy, which is what's the laziest thing we can do to milk fans for more money. So yeah, I actually do think this book is worthy of Eru Iluvatar's blessing, unlike certain other books I could mention, which are only worthy of being sentenced to Watcher in the Water hentai.